Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Alan Meads. Alongside Canterbury Christ Church University Games Design students Ben Chittenden and Michal Mozarjevs, I'm going to talk to you about the Arcade Britannia VR Arcade internship that I led. Firstly, I'll give you a little bit of context. Now, I was born and raised in Broadstairs, a sleepy Victorian seaside resort about 20 miles northeast from Canterbury. And importantly, a couple of miles along the coast from Margate, one of the most popular seaside destinations in all of England. Now, from the 1960s through to the mid-1980s, Margate was a major tourist destination, and this meant that its seafront parade was full of entertainment venues, and specifically amusement arcades. Now, as a child and as an adolescent, I spent all my free time, the summer holidays, after school, weekends, whenever, in the arcades. And this was the beginning of my love for arcades and the foundations for the games design course and indeed this internship. Fast forward some 30 odd years and I've produced a body of research related to video games and arcades and produced a comic series that presents historic accounts of the British arcade called Arcade Tales. Arcade Tales led to an invitation to deliver a public talk at Stanford University out in California, and this in turn led to discussions with MIT Press about a monograph, the first of its kind, telling the story of the British amusement arcade based on interviews with key industry members and lots of archive research. This is in its final stages of proofing and review with MIT Press. Now, during the process of doing this research, we became aware of photographs by Herne Bay photographer and one-time bingo caller George Wilson. And George's photographs offered a rarely seen glimpse into a historic British arcade. This internship project was to create a British arcade in virtual reality using the archive materials that I've collected. And while there already is a VR arcade application out there called New Retro Arcade, its styling and its approach looks nothing like a British arcade. So the plan was to give students archive materials and attempt to produce an arcade. Things like the coin slot industry newspaper, which I managed to obtain an almost complete run of. The ambitious initial plan was to build the arcade in several historical periods, from the early 1900s when arcades first appeared, through to their development in the 1960s, the 1970s and the 1980s. And unlike the American-centric VR environments, this one would include penny pushers and fruit machines, key features of the British arcade and a product of our liberal gambling laws. The plan was to recruit 2 interns, and these were selected by using these 2 images. An advert from the 14th of January 1973 for Ping Pong, the first video game to appear in the UK, made by Oldham-based company Alka, and a colour flyer for the same machine. Now, it's interesting to point out that this was in the UK before Atari's Pong. Now, applicants were asked to create Ping Pong as a 3D model based on only these resources, and this was a really difficult task because there's very little known about these machines compared to others. And here's an example of what was produced. Now, this is excellent. I hadn't expected arcade cabinets of such high quality and resolution, and this led to a rescoping of the internship project. Instead of producing multiple arcades at a lower resolution, we would build a 1980s arcade at a resolution like the one seen here. And so I recruited Michal Mozarjevs, then a first-year games design student, and Ben Chittenden, then a second-year games design student, to produce the work. While they'd work together, Michal's would focus on 3D modelling and Ben on the VR implementation. Now we'll pass over to Michal and Ben to talk about their contribution.
During the internship, I took the role for the artist and was working on models of arcade cabinets. Usually you would use concept art or photographs to recreate something in 3D. As we wanted to make them look as close as possible to the original, we had to use photographs. But there is a problem. Very few photographs and our information is readily available, if at all. While a handful of these machines are still out there, these days they are mostly owned by collectors. And even if some collectors would be happy to help us, we would still need to find them first. And only a few would be able to provide needed photographs or precise measurements. So, we had to follow a different route and make the most of what we already had. And this is where artificial intelligence upscaling comes into play. It allowed us to upscale images without losing sharpness. This method does come with its drawbacks. An example of that would be text. You can see it gets a bit distorted, and some small details might be slightly altered. But from a reasonable distance, in the 3D engine, it looks much clearer compared if we were to use low-resolution photographs. Okay, so now we had recolored the artwork, but we are still missing dimensions. Sometimes an advertisement leaflet or other record of dimension can be found for a specific arcade cabinet, but when it's not the case, we have to resort to other methods for finding out dimensions. One trick I often used is identifying one object in the photograph we can guess dimensions of the most accurately, and using it across the image to measure other objects with. Cabinets made previously were also used as a size reference to keep the scale consistent. Then I would work on transferring all the three-dimensional details I see on photographs onto my model and prepare it for painting. I use software called Substance Painter to create the textures and qualities to the materials the model is made from. I use a mixture of photographs and computer-generated graphics for authentic-looking results. Lastly, I set up a painted model within the game engine, to later be placed in an arcade by my colleague Ben.
So when it came to the internship, I was in charge of the building. But how do you recreate a building from 40 years ago? Well, what I did is I started going through the reference photos that Alan supplied and looking at the actual architecture of the building. So that was me looking at the layouts of the lights, the layout of the room, and the actual design of the change booth as well. Following that, I went through and made 2 or 3 different iterations of the building, being surprised each time that the roof was actually lower than I initially anticipated. So much so that I had to go through and several times lower it over the course of development. Once I finally got the building's layout to look just about right, I had to go through then and get lighting working. When it came to the lights, I had to make sure that the colour of them and the layout actually matched the reference photos. That meant going through and giving everything a slight yellow tint and adding the scrolling lights across the top, as well as giving the change booth a little bit of a glow on its letters. After getting the lighting to a reasonable standpoint, I had to go through and work on the carpet and the doors. The carpet, I needed to make sure didn't look brand new, so I had to go through and add some grime, dirt, and just general wear onto it to make sure that this arcade looked like it'd been brought straight out of the 80s. The doors I had to go through and make sure they had some scratches, the glass itself was dirty, and that they were actually laid out correctly in the same way they would have been. Overall, this internship really helped when it came to designing levels and going through and recreating all of the pre-existing areas. When it comes to the VR side of things, one of the very first things I had to look into deciding on is how the movement was going to work. I could have the participant teleport around, or I could have the walk around. We decided on the latter, where basically what happens is it reads the speed that you're moving your arms and makes that into how fast you're walking. Once we had that all up and running, I had to then go through and make sure all the walls and doors would actually stop the player from walking directly through them. The other thing I had to keep an eye on was the overall performance of the arcade, as if it ended up being too much and the game started to run slow, it could actually cause issues in the actual VR space, where it could trigger motion sickness due to the fluctuation of speeds.
Now, Michal and Ben did a fantastic job under really challenging circumstances. Here's a walkthrough of their VR build. Our intention is to have this VR space ready as an installer that can be exhibited and added to. I'm really grateful for the support that Canterbury Christchurch University offers students and staff through the Research Internship Programme. It gives students an excellent opportunity to develop and apply their skills and is of enormous benefit to staff as well.